Hello everyone and welcome to your week 5 lecture. We'll be continuing with understanding the association or how do you link exposure and diseases and what are the factors which we need to take into consideration before establishing causation. So we covered chances, we covered biases, and now we are going to be covering confounders. And the other two mini topics that we'll be covering today is associations versus causations and epidemiology and prevention. All right, so we'll get started. All right, so three things to cover today: confounders, association versus causation, and epidemiology and prevention. Again, just similar to the last lecture, the real life application of this is that when you have your own project, when you have your own data set, you become more confident in understanding, can I really establish causations over here? Or what are the multiple levels of factors that I need to consider? Okay, so it just helps you to do, say, good and rigorous research. All right. So guys, again, your pre-readings are on the YouTube videos, and these are based upon understanding what are confounders. All right, so now we'll start. So what is a confounder? So confounder is a variable which is associated with your independent variable. It is also associated with your dependent variable. Now guys, when I say associated, it means it is significantly associated, all right? T less than 0.05, okay? And confounder therefore is related to both your exposure and your outcome, all right? Confounder is not simply a consequence or a risk factor of your IV. Okay, so it is associated with both your IV and your DV at a significant level. Now guys, this is a mediation analysis that I did in one of my recent publication, which I have taken up as an example. And the link to the open access article is available in the notes section of this slide. So if at all you have to do mediation analysis in the future, it is very important to refer as to how mediation analysis, there are various techniques to it, how it is done in your area of research, and if this is an applicable area for you in health sciences, it's good to have a look at this article as well, just in case of your future research demands so. All right, so over here, guys, my independent variable is pre-pregnancy BMI. All right, and what am I trying to say is high pre-pregnancy BMI is associated with high risk of depression. So depression is my outcome variable. Okay, so both of them are high. High pre-pregnancy BMI, high risk of depression. So in simple words, if a woman is overweight or obese, okay, so pre-pregnancy, all right, so if a woman in her reproductive years who's not pregnant as of yet, if she is overweight or obese, this is associated with high risk of depression during her pregnancy. Okay, so this is the last one over here. The outcome variable is during pregnancy. All right, so high pre-pregnancy BMI IV, high risk of depression, that is my DV. What is my confounder? My confounder is the vitamin D status, blood vitamin D status. Okay, so I'll hover my mouse over here. So over here, this is my confounding variable. And I found out that I did an analysis. Okay, so I did analysis and I identified that high pre-pregnancy BMI is associated with high vitamin D deficiency. Okay, so yes, there is a significant association over here. All right, and what I also found out that high vitamin D deficiency is associated with high levels of depression. Okay, so this was the vitamin D, my mediator, which was a confounding variable, was associated with both of my independent variable and dependent variable. Okay, so basically the result was that if a woman has high pre-pregnancy BMI, meaning a woman who's not pregnant as of yet, if she's overweight and or obese, all right, such a woman who also has vitamin D deficiency, blood vitamin D deficiency, she is more likely to be at risk of high depression during her pregnancy. Does that make sense? Okay, so vitamin D partially mediated the relationship between BMI and depression. Okay, so vitamin D explained some of the variance in causing depression, okay, alongside BMI. And when these two variables were combined, which is pre-pregnancy BMI, vitamin D, they explained a stronger amount of variance in explaining why a woman could be depressed during or is at a high risk of depression during pregnancy. Does that make sense, guys? So yes, vitamin D is correlated with both overweight and obesity and depression. And that's why vitamin D is a confounding variable. And when I did an analysis, I found out that vitamin D was a mediator. All right. You have then, if I had to teach you quantitative statistics, we would be talking about full mediation, partial mediation, what is a mediator versus what is a moderator. So those things, they come under advanced level quantitative statistics, not even basic level. All right. But this is just an FYI for you to understand. Okay, so at least what is required for this unit is for you to understand the concept of a confounding variable. So over here, the confounding variable is vitamin D, which is confounding the relationship between pre-pregnancy BMI and depression. Okay. All right, so how to control for confounders? The first thing, you have to look at your study design. Okay, so in your study design, the first thing you can do, there are various ways in which you can control for confounders. Which one is most applicable for your research, for your data set? That is something which is for you to discuss with your supervisor, all right? And for you to understand what is the research question. I cannot say this is what you need to do, like all of this is what you need to do. No, I'm giving you a general overview of what are the various strategies in controlling a confounder, which one is applicable, pragmatic for you to use in your own research. That is something for you to decide on an individual level with your research objectives and with your supervisor. All right. So the first thing is restriction of subjects, meaning accordingly you can, this can help you to control for confounders. So basically in our study, what it may mean is that simply don't include the confounders in your study, which is women with vitamin D deficiency. But I couldn't do this, and I did not do this. Why? Because my main research question was to see, okay, what are the various, say, independent variables which are associated with high depression risk among, say, women during pregnancy. Okay, and I found out that their BMI and vitamin D level were strongly correlated to a woman having high risk of depression. Okay, so for me, this was not applicable, but is it applicable for your study design? That is something to be discussed. Okay. Then you have random allocation of subjects to your study group. This is when you have, say, a control group or an intervention group. So you're trying to have randomly allocated subjects. So it is not that your intervention group is only showing this trend and not your control group, so on and so forth. So yes, random allocation helps if you have more than one study group. Okay. Then matching subjects on potential confounders. This is something which is pragmatically possible, especially if you're doing, say, a sort of a quasi-experimental design, or definitely you have to do it if you're doing a randomized control design. All right, so the subject should be matched on basic baseline characteristics is what we say. Your baseline characteristics, they include, say, socio-demographic characteristics such as age, gender, BMI, income, occupation, ethnicity, education, all of that. Okay, that depends upon your research question now. Okay, but generally these are your socio-demographic characteristics that you try to match your subjects on, that you have equal, say you have similar socio-demographic characteristics between your independent or your intervention group and your control group. All right. So over here, for example, if I have, as I said, I have my PhD student. So for her, in her study, if you have, say, a low carbohydrate diet, which is your independent variable, and you have your glycemic control, meaning controlling of your blood sugar level in simple terms. Okay, that is your dependent variable. And if the confounding variable is exercise, this is just an hypothetical example, we will make sure that the intervention group and control group, their exercise levels are similar and they match. Okay, so it shouldn't be that, oh, it is because the individuals, they exercise so well that definitely we have seen the benefits of exercise in controlling your glycemic levels, and that's why exercise could be the reason, not really your low carbohydrate diet. So to avoid this bias, we would be, say, matching subjects on potential confounders. So I hope this makes sense. All right. And as I said, you don't have to worry about doing all of this. When you are, say, controlling for confounders, this is very unique and very targeted. It depends upon your study topic, your research design. All right. Then how do you control for confounders and data analysis? So first, again, over your restriction. So it is still possible, but it means that you're throwing away data. For example, if as I said, if I have my data set on the vitamin D and depression, and if I remove all of the subjects who had, say, vitamin D deficiency, then I'm actually losing so much of data, meaning I'm reducing my sample size. When I reduce my sample size, this affects the power of the statistics. Therefore, then you have a high probability of, say, occurring or conducting type 2 error. So we have spoken about all of that. All right, so this is a very, very critical thing, which is very important to discuss with your supervisor or your statistician involved in your panel, that is this the best way to go? Because ideally it is not. There are other better ways to deal with confounding variables. Okay, so then you have, for example, stratified analysis. So basically the most common way of controlling for confounders, guys, if you do not, if it is going to impact your research question and you don't want to, say, throw your data away, or you don't want to, say, only be recruiting so and so people and not the others, because it is then creating bias. The best way of controlling for confounders, or most popular way, I should say, is by looking at confounders during your data analysis stage. Okay, so for instance, stratified analysis using the Mantel Hasnell method, I'll just call it MH, okay, because I have a funny pronunciation with these kind of words. So yes, you have the MH method to adjust for confounders, okay, for categorical variable. Again, guys, this is all advanced level quantitative statistics, so you don't have to, this unit, the, say, outcome of your unit is not to learn those methods per se, but I'll still show you an SPSS. So in case if you're faced with such a research question and you have the same challenge in your study, you would be knowing that there is a so-and-so method existing. Then it is up to you to discuss that with your supervisor. For example, is this something applicable in our say project or not? All right. So yes, one way of controlling for confounders is by using the MH method for categorical confounding variables. Okay, so for example, categorical confounding variables, meaning your the vitamin D deficiency should be categorical. Like you have deficient population versus non-deficient population. Okay, then you have the other one, which is more popular than the stratified analysis. Okay, because it's very difficult to, say, do a mediation analysis or control for confounders with only categorical variable. Generally, you have a mixture of continuous and categorical variable. So the other one is Andrew Hayes process macros in SPSS. That is for continuous variables. So guys, I have showed you one which is for categorical variable, MH method, one which is for continuous variable, which is the Andrew Hayes method. Then you have a mixture of continuous and categorical variable. For example, say your mediator or your confounding variable is categorical and your outcome variable is continuous, and your, say, maybe your independent variable is again categorical. That was the case in my study. All right, so the vitamin D study which I showed you, that was the case. So in that case, there are specialized equations available. Okay, have I shown you in the other slide? Let me see. Yeah. So guys, there are these Joes and McKinnon's equation and Sobel's test available. So there are various such equations available which can help you to address confounding variables when there are a mixture of continuous and categorical variables. Okay. So again, guys, please understand this is an FYI at this stage. It's just that the theoretical foundation of epidemiology is making you aware that in case if there is a case like this, you know that there is a potential solution. How exactly to do it is something for you to take it at a next level of quantitative statistics. Okay, as I said, epidemiology is the foundation of research. All right, so we are just looking at the theoretical concepts of it. And the last thing, guys, is the last method of controlling for confounders is using model fitting techniques, such as regression techniques. And you also have model fitting techniques, which are more sophisticated, such as structural equation modeling, for instance, which you don't do in SPSS, but you do in programs such as, say, MPlus and MOS and Strata, which are, say, a bit more advanced than, say, your basic SPSS. Okay. So generally, for example, for model fitting, I use MOS, okay, which is, say, partnered with SPSS, and it's very visual. So I like it. It's like, it's easy to use. All right. So guys, basically, as I said, the main take home message over here, confounders, most of the time we control for them, or we adjust for them, or if they are significantly associated, as I said, with your IV and DV, you consider them in your analysis. And analysis is the best stage for us to look at them if it is something which you can't just avoid in your data collection stage or your study designing stage. Okay, so how do you do it? You have stratified analysis, Andrews-Hayes process, and you have those equations. All right. And then the most sophisticated one is model fitting. All right. Okay, guys. So this is just to show you that, yes, you have various equations like this, which you consider when you're doing, say, when you have confounding variables and your IVs, DVs are a mixture of continuous and categorical variable. All right. Whereas you have your MH method, which is your Mantel-Hasnell method. Okay, so this one, how do you do the method? I'll show it to you in the next slide. So guys, I just wanted to show you the Andrews-Hayes. So where exactly do you, like, find it in your SPSS? So you go to analyze, you go to regression, and then you go to process. Okay, so process is where you control for confounding variables, or you say consider them in your analysis, then your variables are continuous in nature. Okay, so it is very easy to do it in SPSS if your variables are continuous in nature, and you have to say consider the confounding variables. Okay, so process is the one. This is not directly available in SPSS. So say in UC, you have to call the IT people, and then they specially help you install process within SPSS. Does that make sense? So you have SPSS, and then you have to install process. Okay, so yes, so that is one. And guys, this is just again an FYI, Mantel-Hassel method. So over here, if you see, my vitamin D is my mediator, and it is categorical in nature. So you are either deficient in vitamin D or you're not deficient in vitamin D. Okay. Then you have the IV, which is your pre-pregnancy BMI. Over here, you are either overweight or obese. So that's one category, or else you are healthy weight. Okay. So in our sample, we did not have underweight. All right. So these were the two categories. And then your outcome variable, which is your dependent variable, is either you're at risk of depression or else you're not at risk of depression. Okay, so everything is categorical in nature, everything is bivariate, and in this case, Mantel-Hassel method can be used. All right, so again, how do you go? You go to descriptive, you go to crosstab. You know how we did Pearson's chi-square test in one of your tutorials? Similarly, you go to crosstab, you enter your, say your IVs and your DVs, which is your weight, depression. You enter your confounding variable, okay, which is over here, your vitamin D. Okay, and then this is the kind of, say, output which you get roughly. So my main research question is that are overweight women and or obese women, are they more likely to be depressed in comparison to healthy weight women if they are suffering from vitamin D deficiency? And if you just simply look at the counts, then yes, more number of overweight women are suffering from depression if they have vitamin D deficiency as well. Okay. So yes, this is, but is this say significant or not? That comes over here. So you have your Mantel MH chi-square. So MH, again, you have the units are in form of chi-squared in degree of freedom, and you have your p-value. So the p-value is significant. Now the p-value is 0.03. Okay. So I hope all of that drilling in the last 2 weeks has helped you to identify that. Do you think this is a very strong, say, a very strong outcome, very strong result? Okay, because I don't think so. And this will be further justified when we look at our odds ratio. Okay, so our odds ratio is 9, but look at the confidence intervals around the odds ratio. You have 1.59 and 50.69. That's like such a big dispersion. Okay, and as I said, when you have bigger the dispersion, you have weaker the effect size. And because our effect size is weaker, it is very, very likely that our p-value will also be weak, and our p-value is certainly weak. I'm not boasting that my data is weak, but it is what it is. This is what we saw in our data. All right. And the sample size was pretty big for our data. It was around, maybe say around 30,000 mothers or so. This is a secondary data set from Canberra Hospital, which we are analyzing. Okay. So guys, at the end, what was it? Overweight, obese mothers. So just to show you in a statement form, now that we have say controlled, we have not controlled, basically we have included confounders in our analysis. Okay, so yes, the first very first rule is the confounding or the potential confounding variable significantly associated with the IV/NDV? If it is, then you go further and do this sort of an analysis. Okay, so yes, overweight and obese mothers are 9 times more likely to be at risk of depression if they are vitamin D deficient. Okay, this is how I would write the statement. And you have your odds ratios, you have your confidence intervals. Your confidence intervals are pretty crappy. So meaning this is not a very strong data, but it is okay. It is what it is. All right. This is what your data shows. And p-value is also not very strong. Okay, so these are the things basically you acknowledge in a limitation section. It doesn't mean, guys, that you have done a bad job. It is just that you have to accept this is the nature of your data. All right. And there are various other things to consider if this was a real life project that you were doing with me, but we won't go into details of that because all of that is quantitative statistics. Okay, but this is good enough for you to understand the basics of what is a confounding variable. How do you say control for confounding variables? You control for confounding variables ideally in regression, but if you have to say consider confounding variables in your analysis, then these are the sort of analysis which you do. Okay. And guys, always remember, confounding variables are not bad. It is actually good to identify if you have any potential confounding variables in your research. Why? What is the real life implication of this? So for instance, if I had to do an intervention on say overweight and obese mothers who are attending the say Canberra Hospital, all right, and the intervention was on say how to reduce the risk of depression or how to manage depression during pregnancy and things like that, I have to consider their vitamin D status as well, because now I know that vitamin D status played a very big role in say having a impact on depression. And there are pathophysiological mechanisms as to how vitamin D can affect mental health. This is something which I teach in a unit called Nutrition and Disease in semester 2. Okay, so how specific nutrients affect your mental health, that is say one of the lectures, not all. All right, so now in my intervention, I have more confidence and say a solid base and an argument as to why I should be looking at mother's vitamin D status in my depression, which is all in my intervention, which is all about depression, because I have a base for it. All right, and why I should be addressing their vitamin D levels in their management or prevention of depression risk. Does that make sense? Okay, so it is good to acknowledge confounding variables, and the studies which you publish which look at these kind of analysis, they are much more stronger studies. They are much more stronger in the sense, not the study designing, but stronger in the sense that you have done a strong data analysis around this. You have really critically, thoroughly examined your variables inside out and made conclusions. All right, so it is a good thing to acknowledge confounding variables in your research. All right, so I hope this helped. But yes, I really, as I said, I love quantitative statistics, so I get very passionate about it when I talk about it. But yeah, I hope you get the essence of it. All right. So guys, now we'll be going on to the mini topic, which is associations versus causations. All right. So now, before we make casual inferences, okay, we know the very first thing which we have to do. And remember, and I know all of you do remember that is that a casual relationship can only, a cause-effect relationship can only be established, as we know, by the study design type. And the most ideal study design is randomized controlled trial. Okay, so that is something which you always have to keep it in your mind. All right. So yes, basically, now just a very broad overview that yes, the aim of epidemiology is to identify what is the cause of something, a disease condition, for example, or what are the risk factors, or what are the determinants. All of it means the same thing. Okay, meaning trying to identify the IV of something happening. All right. Then why is it important to identify the cause? Because once you know the cause, then only can you design systematic interventions. As I said, for me to design an intervention on, say, prevention of depression risk during pregnancy, now I know the causes are not just your BMI, but even your vitamin D levels. So I need to take these two factors into consideration before I design an intervention for addressing risk of depression among women attending the Canberra hospital. Okay. Then, so to establish a cause and effect relationship, you there are specific criteria that needs to be met. Now, guys, the remaining of the lecture which is there for today's lecture, it is all it is there. It's all around, say, several theoretical epidemiological concepts. Okay, so a lot of pragmatic things I have already taught you, okay, in all of your 4 lectures and 4.5 lectures, so even with the confounding variables. Now which I'm showing you are a few theoretical concepts in epidemiology which we will need to learn and appreciate, especially because you're learning epi for the very first time. Okay, the foundation of research. All right, so yes, it may seem a bit theoretical, the remaining slides, but it is good for you to know these, especially because you are just starting off with your research. Like not all of you, but probably most of you. All right, so yes, what are your selection criteria? First is the, before you make a causal inference, meaning before you say this causes that, you need to consider the strength of association. As I have said, this is extremely, extremely important. All right, and you know, how do you consider the strength of association? Strength of association is equal to effect size. Okay, the stronger the effect size, meaning you have stronger the association between IV or EV. And what does that mean? It means it is less likely that this relationship has just occurred because of chance. Okay, so you are more confident in your result that there could be, say, a cause and effect relationship if you have a very, very strong effect size. All right, and as I said, the indicators of effect size are something like 95% confidence interval. In Pearson's correlation, you have the R value. If you do regression, you have beta value. These are the things which are, say, indicators, standardized indicators of effect size. Okay, so yes, so see over here I have written smoking is associated with lung cancer beta value. So now this beta value is from regression. Okay, so now guys, see this, I may have just done a simple cross-sectional study and found that smoking is associated with lung cancer. This is my beta value, this is my p value, but this gives me credibility in thinking that probably I should design a much more stronger study in the future, because there is say potential, there is a potential for a, say, cause and effect relationship between smoking and cancer. So after this pilot project, then my next step would be to design a quasi-experimental design and to prove this with much more solidarity, or maybe a prospective cohort or a longitudinal design. All right. So consistency of finding is the second selection criteria, which is very important. Consistency, as I said, consistency means reliability. Okay. High reliability, meaning more confidence you have in your finding. So basically, if you find the same finding, which is smoking is associated with this lung cancer, okay, and if you observe this among various different population around the globe, Indian, Australian, Chinese, in various different study designs, it could be prospective cohort, RCT, cross-sectional, all of them are telling you the same story, that yes, smoking is associated with cancer. Majority of them have a very strong effect size. All right, so what does this mean? It means that yes, definitely there is a big noise happening over here showing us that there could be a cause and effect relationship. All right, so I hope that makes sense. So then you have specificity of the association, meaning what does it mean? It means that your smoking, which is your IV, is associated with only one outcome, which is DV, okay, and vice versa. And if you say fail to satisfy this condition, meaning smoking is only associated with cancer, but basically it doesn't mean that there is no cause and effect relationship. It means you need to investigate this relationship further. So what does it mean? It means that you know that smoking, yes, it is associated with cancer, but it is not just associated with lung cancer. It could be, say, cancer of the mouth. It could be cancer of the esophagus. It could also be associated with stroke, heart conditions, dental condition, or even psychosocial outcomes such as depression and things. So yes, smoking could be associated with various types of outcome. Similarly, when you have lung cancer, the determinants of lung cancer could be various things. One could be smoking. The other thing could be other things such as radiations and diet inflammatory index. So now DII, diet inflammatory index, that's another concept where you when you can calculate the inflammatory index of your diet. All right. Very interesting concept. But basically, what am I trying to say? That yes, you want to find out that smoking is associated with cancer. You want to be specific about it, and but you cannot ignore other IVs and DVs in the picture. Okay, so basically then what do? You see how much of variance has smoking say explained of cancer. Okay, we spoke about the concept of variance, so that is very important. More explanation of the variance by smoking for cancer, stronger is the association. All right, and stronger are your say chances of finding a cause and effect relationship. All right. Okay, so then you have temporal sequence of association. So basically, what does it mean? It means that your IV should come before your DV. You should your direction of your relationship should be clarified. Okay, meaning you can't have cancer coming first and then smoking. Okay, so basically you need to be clear about what is your IV, what is your DV, how are you clear about the direction of your association. That is done generally by strong quasi-experimental designs, randomized control designs. Now guys, you will have to appreciate in this case, say a example such as smoking and cancer. Yes, you can have quasi-experimental design or say prospective cohort design where you're following a group of people who are already smoking, and then you're seeing if they're developing cancer or not. And then you have group of another people who have the similar baseline characteristics. You're following them. And if they do happen to develop smoke, if they do happen to start smoking, you want to see whether they are developing cancer, or they may choose not to smoke, and you want to see how many of them do develop cancer. Okay, there could be multiple groups that you may have. But basically, what am I saying? In such an example, smoking associated with cancer, you prospective cohort design or a longitudinal study design may be the best way to move forward, because you cannot randomize people, say a double-blind randomized control trial, to say a smoker group and a non-smoker group, because then people who are not smoking, if they are allocated in a smoker group, it is not ethical for them to for you to ask, okay, now you start smoking and I see the impact of this on your lung cancer. No, right? So basically, what am I saying? That yes, randomized control trial is the gold standard for establishing cause and effect relationship, but it may not ethically always be possible to do an RCT. Various other reasons as to why it may not be possible, because of feasibility, in terms of time, energy, money, labor, resource, all of that. But very, very important, even ethical reasons. Okay, so an example such as smoking cancer, you may be better off with prospective cohort designs. Does that make sense? But there is another example which I'll show you how you would be what it would be useful for you to do an RCT in a smoking cancer sort of a experiment. Okay, but I'll come to that. All right, then you have biological gradient. So what does biological gradient mean? It means that you have a, say, dose response relationship, meaning more the exposure, meaning more smoking. It could be, say, number of cigarettes which you have, say, in a day or in a week, something like that, and more the risk of cancer, your lung cancer. Okay, so there should be a biological gradient. So these are, say, basically say specific selection criteria which will help you to decide, do you think that there is a cause and effect relationship? Okay, and biological plausibility, meaning there should be an underlying pathophysiological mechanism for you to explain how smoking could be associated with cancer. For example, oxidative stress, and then you have systemic inflammation, and systemic inflammation or inflammation, say a chronic inflammation at an underlying level, very, very high risk of cancer. Okay, so basically the mechanism of inflammation is something which I teach a lot in this unit, again, nutrition and disease. Okay, so does that make sense, guys? So, and even if it is something very, very new, you may have to find out the pathophysiological mechanism to say support your say your research question as to how X would be associated with Y. So if you have very, very new variables, for example, I just read a article today which said that selenium deficiency, so selenium, the micronutrient, selenium deficiency is associated with high mortality risk because of COVID-19. Okay, so now they have a pathophysiological mechanism that what does selenium deficiency do in the body, which increases mortality risk because of corona. All right, so there's a new pathophysiological mechanism. So basically, what am I saying? It's not that a mechanism should be existing. You may be the one to identify and discover that mechanism. Makes sense, guys? Very interesting, right? I don't know. I think it's very interesting. Okay, so then you have coherence. So it is, does the relationship agree with the current knowledge? Okay, so for example, as I said, that something like smoking and cancer, it is so very much well established in the literature that yes, there is a lot of existing knowledge around that to support your hypothesis that smoking could be a potential cause of cancer. Okay, so yes, you have a lot of say existing history, biological mechanisms around it. But if not, if you do not have an existing mechanism around it, you have to investigate what could be the potential mechanism. So the very, very first lecture which we had on cholera, so see, I finally learned, because I used to confuse cholera with corona for some case, like the way you pronounce. So I just couldn't pronounce it in the first lecture. Yesterday night, I practiced it like cholera, cholera. So now I've got it. Okay. So yes, you have cholera. So now with cholera, we saw that in the first lecture that the poor guy used to keep saying that, look, it is, if you drink out of this water pump, those people are more likely to get, those people are more likely to die because of cholera. But he couldn't understand or couldn't explain at that time the mechanism. Why is it that it is this water pump which is actually causing this disease condition? But then he discovered the mechanism, that it is actually because it is not the water pump per se, but it is the contaminated water, fecal contaminated water, which is flowing through this water pump. Okay, so that was the pathophysiological mechanism as to why people were getting the disease condition. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's why it is important to understand or identify the pathophysiological mechanism if it is not already existing. All right, and then you have experiment. So yes, of course, we know that double-blind randomized control trial is the one which supports causality. All right. So now, guys, over here, for instance, the example which I have given, if you see change dose. Yes, so for instance, you may have, say, a study in which you see that the more the number of cigarettes the people were smoking, your participants were smoking per day, their lung cancer outcomes were faster. So they developed cancer faster, and maybe they develop stage 3 and stage 4 cancer, or maybe they develop cancer with meta-analysis. So maybe the adverse outcomes were much more worse if they smoked a lot of cigarettes per day. Okay, so this could be, say, a dose response change. For this, an RCT could be definitely possible, because you may select subjects which by their choice are smoking a, say, X number of cigarettes per day, and they could be in one group, whereas in other group you will have, say, people who are smoking less number of cigarettes per day than the first group, and then you may have a third group who's not smoking at all. Okay, and then you are seeing a dose response relationship. So now, do you see how a RCT sort of a study, not double blind, of course it can't be double blind in this case, but it still can be sort of an RCT, where you may see that the number of cigarettes smoked and then what is the impact on their outcome. Okay, but I would still call this a quasi experimental design, not a randomized control trial, because see, now in randomized control trial, generally the most ideal approach when you do a randomized control trial is when you are offering something to your participants in terms of some sort of an intervention. Your intervention could be, say, a nicotine patch, or an intervention could be a pill, or intervention should be, say, more in forms of psychosocial or health education behavior, such as cognitive behavior therapy, things like that. Okay, so that is when you have a randomized control intervention trial. All right, the example which we have over here, three groups, say active smokers versus those which are not smoking that much and then no smoking. This is still a quasi experimental design. Not saying that quasi experimental designs are bad. You know, a strong, well designed quasi experimental design is also good. But then, as I said, when you have a lot of, say, researchers across the globe doing similar quasi-experimental design, and all of them are showing the same sort of result, which is, yes, smoking is associated with cancer, then this improves the degree of level of evidence, NHMRC level of evidence. You know how you had level 1, 2, 3, 4 evidence like that? It makes the evidence stronger, even when you have multiple quasi well-structured experimental designs showing you the same thing. All right. Then you have, for example, RCTs can effectively control for various confounders. Absolutely, it can. As I said, when you say, when you recruit subjects in your participants, you could make sure that they have, say, a similar socio-demographic and anthropometric status for your study for smoking and cancer. Okay, and that their baseline characteristics are similar when they are, say, put into these three groups. Okay, so yes, a randomized control trial can control for various confounders which you think could potentially impact, say, lung cancer outcome. All right, so you can't have one group which was 60 plus and then you say, oh yeah, that group had the worst cancer outcome. Yes, but they are 60 plus and then you're comparing it to someone who are in their 20s. That's not ethical, or that's not right also. Okay, it's not fair. All right, so you'll have similar socio-demographic characteristics. All right, then RCTs can also minimize bias and outcomes simply due to chance. Absolutely. Why? Because you're controlling for a lot of confounding variables to begin with. And if there are any such confounding variables, you can further control them during your data analysis stage. And then you can say, irrespective of these confounding variables, there exists a relationship between smoking and cancer. And that is very well possible when you do multivariate analysis such as regression. All right. Okay, guys, so this is ranking of your studies to support causality. As I said, yes, RCT is the biggest one which can prove your, say, cause and effect relationship. Then you have community randomized control trials as well, like your cluster randomized control trials. You have your prospective studies, retrospective studies, case control, cross-sectional, ecological, case report, case series, or case studies. Okay, those one individual cases, for example. And guys, this is the same sort of, say, chronological evidence, which is provided to you in the NHMRC level of evidence table. Okay, if we haven't come through the NHMRC level of evidence table, I'm sure we will be coming, we will be looking at that in one of your, say, lectures. But I think I covered it in week 2 when I did the study designs. If not, it's definitely covered as part of this unit, NHMRC level of evidence table. Okay. All right. Then you have another theoretical model in epidemiology that is called as the triangle of epidemiology. Okay, so guys, sorry, before I go on to that, I just want to say that all of this which we studied, okay, which is, say, selection criteria for making causal inferences, yes, in theory it sounds, say, very say straightforward and all right, but trust me, when you actually do this in practice, it makes a lot more sense. For example, if my objective over here is to control for confounding variables, I would be using a specific type of statistics such as regression, in which I can control for confounding variables, or adjust for confounding variables, how it is rightly said in regression. But if I want to see whether the confounding variable is actually a confounder, meaning it is significantly associated with IV and DV, then I would not be controlling for that. I would be actually including it, inviting it in the analysis, which could be in form of a mediation analysis or a moderation analysis, and then I would be running the analysis. Does it make sense? So it depends a lot on your research question as to how do you control for confounders, adjust for confounders, and how they would affect your cause and effect relationship. All right, so it all makes more sense. That's why epi is, like, say, so close to quantitative statistics, because once you understand the theory behind it, then the application into quantitative statistics makes a lot of sense, because you know the sciences as to why you are controlling for something or you're adjusting for something and why is it important. Okay. So now the triangle of epidemiology. So generally the epidemiological triangle, it is used to study infectious diseases or communicable diseases. That is where the triangle is most commonly applied. Okay, so for example, you have in the triangle, you have the three things: agent, environment, and host, which is what we are talking about. So agent you have over here, which is the cause of the disease, meaning what? Okay, so you have Vibrio cholerae, okay, which causes your cholera. All right, then you have your host, which is say your organism harboring the disease, meaning who is then having the cholera? It's humans. Okay, so this is the what question, this is the who question. Then you have environment, or all those external factors that are allowing for the disease transmission, meaning where. So over here we know that Vibrio cholerae is a waterborne disease condition, infectious condition, and it is transmitted through contaminated water. Okay, so water is the one which is harboring the disease, irrespective of the water coming out of a water pump or a pipe or a well. Does that make sense? Okay, so the environment is where. All right, and time, for instance, it is at the end, the conclusion is more time you take in identifying the treatment, more risk of morbidity and mortality. That is what we are seeing in corona, right, guys? So with COVID, we see that until now we haven't found the vaccine. Okay, and because we haven't found the vaccine, there is more risk of morbidity and mortality, and that is what is happening globally. Once the treatment is identified, then your incidence rate will go down, and potentially your prevalence rate will also go down, because with this infectious condition of COVID, it is either or not sort of an answer, meaning once you have the vaccine, then you don't have to worry about the increasing incidence rate and prevalence rate, because vaccine is like the solution. So for COVID or infectious disease, it is not like type 2 diabetes, okay, where there is just management, there is no cure possible. Hopefully, yes, there is a cure possible for COVID. So once we have it, then the morbidity and mortality will go down. Make sense? Okay, so yes, our aim as an epidemiologist is to break the triangle, meaning break at least one of these sides of the triangle. You break one of these sides, the triangle, the say the loop effect will stop. All right. So yes, so how did the first in epidemiology, the father of epidemiology, how did he break the triangle? He broke the triangle by identifying the sanitary movement. Okay, meaning the water should be potable, no drinking water or any source of water basically which we are using for human consumption or external use should be contaminated with feces. Okay, therefore we had the big sanitary movement, and sanitary movement helped to break the epidemiological triangle. Similarly, in terms of COVID, once we have the vaccine, vaccine will help to break the COVID triangle. Does that make sense? Okay. So, oh yes, that's what I've written over here. It's like when the same person who designs the lecture teaches, you sometimes start thinking one step forward, and that's what I see that I've already written that for you. That yes, once you have the vaccine, which is called as severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2, this is the vaccine for say COVID. So once we have this vaccine, then yes, we can stop the spread of COVID. All right. Okay, then you have causal models, which is again a theoretical model in epidemiology. Okay, it is developed by this person, Kenneth Rothmans. All right, component cause theory. So basically, what is it saying? It is saying that there are various risk factors which may be responsible for an outcome. Okay, so this is say a causal pie. Okay, so various risk factors which is causing an outcome. Okay, so without all of these risk factors, the outcome would not have occurred at that specific point in a time. All right, so over here this example is really good, guys. So what is this example talking about? That basically the outcome is you breaking your wrist. Okay, so you broke your wrist, or basically you got a fracture, right? You broke your wrist, meaning you got a fracture. So why did you get a fracture? All right. So what happened was that this was say maybe in United States, in Pennsylvania, where it is like snowing, cats and dogs. Okay, or maybe in Canada somewhere. Okay, so basically it's in a snowy country. Okay, so basically in a snowy country, you took your dog outside for a walk. Okay, and it was really, really slippery, and you slipped. And when you slipped, you broke your wrist. Okay, you had a fracture. Okay, so why did you have a fracture? There are multiple risk factors or determinants for it. Firstly, It is because you had a low calcium intake, therefore you had a poor bone mineral density, all right? And that's why you were at a risk of getting a fracture. Maybe if someone else would have fallen, they wouldn't have got a fracture, probably because they have a high bone mineral density. So who knows, okay? So impaired balance because it was snowy and slippery. You lost your balance, you fell, therefore you got a fracture. The type of shoe, you didn't have the best shoes on to walk in the snow and therefore you fell and you had a fracture. Icy path, okay, which is what we spoke about. You were walking a dog, the dog saw a squirrel, the dog started chasing a squirrel, and that's why you fell and had a fracture. And basically the most immediate reason you having a fracture is because you fell, all right? So does that make sense, guys? So there are multiple determinants for your one outcome, which is you having a fracture. Okay, but if we see the blue thing, all right, which is fall, that is the biggest variance. So the biggest variance which is explained in you having a fracture is you falling. Okay, this is what I was trying to say from the last two lectures, which is very, very important when you consider epidemiology as the foundation of your quantitative methods. How much of variance is explained by your independent variable? If you have so many independent variable, maximum variance is explained by the fall, okay? And the second one is explained by the icy path. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, so this is what is important. So the amount of variance which is explained by your IVs, all right? Okay, so you had 7 risk factors which led to your outcome, which is the 7 risk factors for the fracture as your outcome. Okay, so calcium intake and fall has explained 30% of the variance in fracture. So this calcium intake, which is your dark blue color, okay, and the fall has explained 30% of the variance. And you know, maybe the remaining, say, 25% of the variance is explained by icy path. Basically, more variance you can explain, more stronger is your model. So in your study, if you asked the person who fell, okay, so why did you get a fracture? And she said, because I fell. Okay, so that is explaining a very big part of your variance. And then you look at her dietary record and you come to know that, oh yes, it's because she's having a poor calcium intake as well, right? And the path was icy, she said, right? So for example, if you collected data on 3 things, okay, not all of the factors, all right? If you collected data on 3 things, which is say your fall, your calcium intake, and say your icy path, this would be explaining at least 75% of the variance in the study. Does that make sense, guys? So this is what I'm trying to say, is that at the end, what is important in epidemiology is to identify how much of variance is explained by your IV for your DV. Okay, it is literally not very possible in, say, human studies, okay, where you have one IV which is explaining 100% variance in your DV. You try to identify IVs which are explaining a lot of variance in your DV, but that doesn't mean 100% by just one independent variable. There are multiple independent variable. You're trying to identify which one is explaining the maximum variance in your study. Okay, and sometimes, guys, it is not just about identifying which one is explaining the maximum variance. Now see, within this, okay, within this, let's see, within the 3 factors which we said, you collected, you know that the person fell, okay, calcium intake and icy path, okay, 3 ones, all right? Now, if you had to say design an intervention, can you change the fact that the person fell? No. Okay, the person may fall anytime, all right? So it is not something which is a modifiable factor as such, all right? So you can't really change that. Then you have the other thing, which is icy path. Can you stop, can you make it stop snowing? No, you can't do that. Okay, that is also not modifiable. What is the only modifiable factor which is in your control? Which is calcium intake. Okay, so yes, you can modify a person's diet. You can encourage them to eat so and so foods. They can improve their bone mineral density status. Okay, and this will help them or make them stronger in, say, even if they fall the next time, they may not be breaking their risk, Maybe they may be having a hairline fracture, or maybe just a swelling or a sprain, or maybe nothing at the end, even if they fall. Okay. So yes, at the end, it is important to identify what is explaining the maximum amount of variance. But what is also important is, apart from explaining maximum amount of variance, what is it that I can really modify as a scientist as part of my study? Okay, I can't stop it to snow. I can't ask her, hey, you should walk better and not keep falling all the time. No, it can happen to anyone. Okay, but I can modify her dietary intake. Does that make sense? It's just of the three which I'm considering. Okay, not of all of this which is there. All right, but of course, if you were, say, a podiatrist, you would be more interested in the type of shoe wear and things like that. So as a dietitian, I'm more interested in the calcium intake. Does that make sense? So it is not that the others are not modifiable. Others are modifiable depending upon what is your area of expertise. Okay, so I really hope this helps you to make sense. So basically, why are these theoretical models important? Is to teach you the theoretical foundations of, yes, explaining of variance is important, but there is another important thing, which is to understand what is it that you can modify as a scientist. Isn't that the very first question which we ask as an epidemiologist, which is, what is the solution? As an epidemiologist, at the end, you want to find what is the solution. And many a times you can find solution to things which are modifiable in nature. If you can't really change it, what do you do about it? Okay, you can't do anything about it. All right, you can't make it stop snowing. So what is the next best thing to do, which is modifiable, which is in your control? All right, so I hope this makes a lot of sense, guys. Oh yes, and that is what I cover in this slide actually. So guys, this is the web of causation. So now that you understand the concept of variance, which has been slowly fed to you throughout a couple of lectures, now the second important thing for you to think as an epidemiologist is the web of causation, meaning determinant analysis. And I teach this in greater detail in the unit community and public health nutrition, because in community and public health nutrition, I actually teach you how to design interventions. How do you implement interventions? How do you evaluate intervention? And how do you disseminate the findings? Okay, so it is the entire program planning cycle. So I can't go into that detail because that is another subject, which is, say, intervention, designing, implementation, evaluation. But over here, I just want you to appreciate the fact that yes, in epidemiology, you're trying to find out the variance of the multiple independent variables. But the second thing you want to see is, what is it that I can modify? Okay, so I'll show you how determinant analysis is done, say, in a theoretical way, but how I do it in my brain, which is, for me, I just make it simple. Is it modifiable? Is it something that I can change, or is it something which I cannot change? If it is something I can change, that is the variable I want to intervene, because it is in my control and it is in the opposite person's control. It may be in my control, but what if the participant, it's not practical for the participant? For example, I may tell the participant, get nice quality shoes and this and that, but what if they can't afford it? Okay, so maybe that is something which I think is modifiable, but it is not modifiable for the participants. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's why you have to come. That's why determinant analysis is so important, because as part of determinant analysis, guys, the other thing which you do in real life, which I won't touch into this, I promise, is just remember this term, need analysis. Okay, so basically need analysis, or it is also called as intellectual assessment, okay, or problem analysis. All right, so basically that is where you ask the question, yes, these are modifiable factors, but now what is pragmatic for my participants to change, to adapt, to accept? Okay, so that is the third level. You see how there are various levels of it. First, you just want to see the variance. Then you want to see what is modifiable and non modifiable. Then you want to see what is pragmatic and what is something which is in reach and which is practical for your participants to change. Maybe buying new good shoe is not possible for them. Maybe it is not economical for them. But maybe if I ask them to, say, have a small little cup of yogurts, like just Cole's yogurt home brand, and they would be happy with that. Okay, so it depends. All right, so that is where you do need analysis to find out what is it that my participants can really change and how can I make an impact. All right, okay. So yes, you have your determinant analysis in the textbook, which can be classified as predisposing factors such as your personal attitude, behaviors, perceptions, belief, which for example I have given is because I'm young, I will always lose weight easily. I'm not that young. I'm just saying I always give this example to my young students, okay, who are 10 to 12 or 15 years younger than me. All right. So yes, so predisposing factors is like, for example, your personal attitudes, beliefs, and thoughts. Then you have your enabling factors, which could be, say, your physical factors that promote or demote health. Okay, for example, why obesity is so rampant? Because we all know that something like Oreo comes for, say, 90 cents. Okay, and your fruit and vegetables, they are like what? $7 per kg of apples and tomatoes, which is so sad. All right. But if you see, guys, it makes a lot of sense. It takes a lot of hard work to grow your fruit and veggie. All right. Whereas to process a biscuit out of a factory on a large scale is much more cheaper. But to grow the same amount of fruit and veggie, that is much more expensive. Okay. So there is so much more labor by our lovely farmers, which is going on in growing nutritious food products. All right. Then you have your reinforcing factors, which could be social factors that promote or demote health. For example, peer pressure, okay, among teens or among young adults, that everyone is smoking and it is considered cool. So maybe maybe I should also adopt that behavior for me to be part of the in circle. Now, smoking still has a lot of, say, social stigma around it, which is a good thing. Some stigmas are good, which is stop smoking, okay? But yes, the other thing, for example, which I've seen a lot of, say, individuals express to me in the consultation is for drinking. For example, they may not be really big drinkers, but then they are left out of the social circle. And we know in Australia, we do have a drinking culture, lot in terms of, say, social gatherings and things. And if they don't adapt the same behavior, they feel left out. Okay, so this is the kind of, say, thoughts which is shared by individuals. So now this is where there could be again peer pressure, that you drink socially, although you don't drink that much, but because to be accepted in the circle. All right. So this is how determinants can be defined. All right, this is one of the textbook definition of determinant classification. Then you define determinants as proximal or distal determinants or direct or indirect determinants. So this is what is there in the diagram. So these are your direct determinants. Direct determinants are more closer to the outcome. Okay, and indirect determinants are much more further away. Okay, so these are called as proximal, these are called as distal, or you have direct determinants or indirect determinants. They are also called as downstream determinants or upstream determinants. Lot of terminology, basically it means the same thing. All right, so for example, over here, if you have high prevalence of obesity, so now within this, for instance, the most direct determinants are high energy intake and you have less energy expenditure. These are the two main causes as to why you have obesity. Okay, when you have an imbalance in the energy intake versus energy expenditure, energy intake going up, energy expenditure going down. Okay, but why the energy intake is going up? Now this could be because of various reasons, such as high consumption of your processed food or junk food in simple terms, and you have less consumption of your nutritious food such as your fruits, veggies, all right, which are energy dense, which are nutrient dense. All right. So yes, less amount of that. But now, why are you consuming high amount of junk food? It could be because they are cheaper. All right. And then the other thing could be that they are affordable, and it could be because you have not that great, say, cooking skills. That's why this becomes easier for you. You have your job and time commitments. Okay, so these factors keep on growing and growing. All right. So basically, this is what I'm saying. This is the web of causation, all right, with your direct and indirect determinants. Within this, now you have to select that which are the modifiable ones, which are the non-modifiable ones. Within the modifiable ones, what are the factors which my participant can practically accept and take as part of their lifestyle, all right, and those factors are the one which you have to intervene. Okay, so I hope the entire step, like, holistically makes a lot more sense now. All right. Okay, so now the last bit which we are doing is epidemiology in prevention. So this is just an FYI, the various types of prevention. So the first one is, say, primordial prevention, meaning you start prevention at a very early stage, even before you see the presence of the risk factors, such as we all know that 3 months of folic acid supplementation is encouraged before conception. Okay, why? It is for to prepare the body for conception. All right, so then you don't have neural tube defects and concerns as such. All right, so this is called as primordial prevention, meaning before there are any chances of, say, neural tube defects or low folic acid blood levels or folic acid deficiency, you're preparing your body well beforehand. Therefore, the encouragement of, say, planning a baby. All right. Then you have primary prevention. So what is primary prevention? Where you are preventing, say, the incidence rate, okay, where you're trying to prevent new cases happening, which is you encourage healthy lifestyle, diet, exercise, etc. for individuals to have who may be at risk of type 2 diabetes. Okay. So that is called primary prevention. Secondary prevention, over here, you already have the prevalence, meaning there are existing cases of patients with type 2 diabetes, and now it is more about disease management, okay, meaning for them to not have, say, worst consequences. Okay, so you're trying to, say, manage newly diagnosed cases, for example, okay, or to teach them how best to, say, cope with type 2 diabetes. Then you have the third one, which is called as tertiary prevention, which is disease progression. Okay, so disease progression, meaning you want to prevent the complications of type 2 diabetes, like you have your neuropathy, nephropathy, retinopathy, all of those. Okay, so these are your different levels of prevention. Now, again, this is the last theoretical model which I'll be speaking about. You have two approaches to prevention. You have the whole population approach, or you have the high risk approach, and there are pros and cons for the same. Okay, so now this side is the whole population approach, whereas this is high risk. So with high risk, for example, what does it mean is that if you're targeting your intervention only to the high risk population, okay, so then what are the pros and cons? Definitely it is cost effective, because high risk population are only those individuals who are, say, at high risk of type 2 diabetes. It is not the entire population. Okay, so you're targeting only those individuals, so definitely it is cost effective because it is less number of people. All right, but when you are looking, but if you are doing, say, prevention at a population level, meaning then you have, say, a stereotype change. You know how I said now that we are well aware about these, say, demerits of smoking. Now there is a positive social stigma around smoking. Okay, smoking is not appreciated in our culture. All right, be it, say, Australian culture or be it Indian culture, everywhere around the globe, even when I went to United States, nobody thinks about smoking how we thought about smoking in the 60s, that, oh yeah, smoking is cool. Now we don't have advertisement about, say, a guy smoking and that is considered cool. No, there is a stigma around smoking. Okay, so basically you have a change in perception at a societal level. And when the society starts accepting a norm, which is smoking is not cool, this then influences behavior at a long run, okay, for the entire population. So yes, this is much more, say, difficult to do. This is much more challenging to do, much more, say, time consuming and more cost, okay, to make it a public health campaign for people to stop smoking. But yes, it's good in the long run. All right. Then you have, with the high risk population, the advantage is that individuals may be more motivated to change their behavior. Absolutely. Because when I know I'm at a high risk of something, say, maybe, say, type 2 diabetes or cancer or something like that, because it's running in my family, I'm more motivated, generally speaking. Okay, individual cases may differ, but generally speaking, I would be more motivated than somebody else who's just walking on the street and maybe they have no history of type 2 diabetes or cancer in their family. They may not really be motivated to listen to your health messages, because they said, why should I worry about it? It's not running in my family. Just like, a general norm. Okay, so yes, those individuals are more likely to be motivated, high risk individuals. Whereas over here, when you have that risk reduction can be achieved at population rather than individual level incidences. Okay, so as I said over here, when you have, say, a change in the societal norm, where the society starts accepting that no, smoking is not cool, smoking will not be encouraged, you will not be having, say, advertisement media which is promoting smoking. Over and above on the smoking packs, now you have, you know, those pictures of cancer and thing. So basically the society as a whole is discouraging the behavior. So there is greater likelihood that you will have less incidence rate, all right? Because now people will be discouraged because there is high tax. So purchasing cigarettes is very expensive. It is not a cheap thing. All right. There is a societal stigma to it. So yes, it is a great likelihood that you will have a decrease in incidence rate. Okay. At a population level. All right. Then you have over here with high risk, easier for clinician researchers to promote change in a smaller group. As I said, of course, this is about capacity. Okay, you have a tinier group, it is easier to promote change. All right, so it is something similar to my postdoctoral research at Western Sydney University, where we went to the Wollondally Shire, and Wollondally is just at the outskirts of Sydney, Campbelltown, and there is a very high risk of type 2 diabetes over there. All right, so we promoted a change within a smaller group, which is we intervened people who were at risk of diabetes, but it was only pertaining to the Wollondally Shire. Okay, so it was much more manageable. All right, cost effective. Then you have, for instance, cost effective for rare genetic condition. Yes, this is very important. Now, guys, some things may not be required at a population level. For example, when you have rare genetic conditions, such as say phenylketonuria. So when I did my postdoc at United States at Emory University, the main population that we were working with was individuals with rare genetic metabolic conditions. And the most prominent one was PKU. Now there were, say you do not have, now you don't have government coming and having, say, health messages such as 2 and 5. Like, you know how in Australia, we had a big push for 2 fruits and 5 veggies. You could see those stickers and banners on the bus, on the railway stops, everywhere, okay? You don't have to do this level of, say, advertisement for rare genetic condition, which is not as prevalent in the population, okay? But that doesn't mean you ignore the population, but basically your intervention becomes much more channelized, all right? And because your intervention is channelized for only those targeted people, therefore you have therefore it is more cost effective. So for example, we used to hold my supervisor, the principal supervisor over there, and all of us under her supervision, we used to hold a metabolic camp at Emory University. So within this metabolic camp, you had individuals all across United States, and some even used to come from overseas like UK and Spain. They used to attend this 1 week of metabolic camp where individuals with phenylketonuria and other rare genetic metabolic condition, they were taught about various things, about lifestyle, about exercise, about nutrition, where I come into the role. All right, so we used to teach them about various things in that metabolic camp. Okay, but it was much more cost effective rather than running a big governmental public health campaign. Does that make sense? Okay, so yes, it was and the research showed that it was very effective for the patients as well in the long run, because it was so targeted to that unique population. All right. Then over here at a population level, you may have a dose response relationship, meaning shifting the entire population to a lower risk. Okay. So for example, healthy eating, as I said, 2 fruit and 5 veggie. Okay. This is going to help you in the long run by decreasing your risk of non-communicable diseases such as your obesity and type 2 diabetes. Okay. So a change in health, change in lifestyle, adapting a healthy lifestyle such as 2 fruits and 5 veggie will have benefits in the long run, not just for one disease condition, but say for a domain or a cluster of disease conditions such as non-communicable diseases. All right, heart health, obesity, diabetes. All right, then you have over here you have large number in high risk, you have large number of people exposed to small risk. Yes, this is a very interesting thing, guys. Okay, so when you have so COVID in its sense started as a very small risk, okay, but when you have large number of people who are exposed to that small risk, then it will generate a lot more cases. Okay, but when you have a small number of people who are exposed to a large risk, okay, such as food poisoning on a cruise ship, but that will generate small number of cases because that food poisoning is only stuck and pertaining to that ship. Does that make sense? Okay, so it has an inverse relationship. All right, so large number of people exposed even to a small risk, then that risk technically does not remain small because you have so many cases of COVID. All right, but if you are going on a cruise ship and if you are say exposed to food poisoning, all right, so you will have a small number of cases, say in comparison to various other cruise ship going around the world, because it was only your ship which had food poisoning. It is only pertaining to your ship. All right, so this is the inverse association which you see over here within the high risk group. Whereas lastly over here, as I said, this point actually continues with this, is that when you're promoting generic health promotion messages, just such as 2 fruits and 5 veggie, you will not see the results immediately, but you will see them in the long run. Like you have a big debate on sugar tax and salt tax. All right, so right now the evaluation of this sugar and salt tax generally has shown that this has decreased the consumption of sugar sweetened beverages, and in some countries where you have salt tax as well, like sodium, excess amount of sodium which is added, not salt as in like your normal cooking salt, then in that cases it has decreased the amount of say processed food consumption. So yes, on a long run the evaluation has shown it has decreased intake. Now does this decrease intake equate to say decrease in overweight and obesity levels or chronic health disorder levels like diabetes and CVD or hypertension? Studies are still yet to tell us, but in the long run you will see this will be much more beneficial to the healthcare system in terms of economic burden to the country. All right, so yeah guys, I hope this makes sense. Okay, so yes, the last thing which we are going to cover is the Rosas hypothesis, meaning should we take an approach of a high risk approach in say prevention in terms of epidemiology, or should we take the whole population approach when we are talking about epidemiological prevention programs? Okay, so over here what it says, the Rose hypothesis, what does it say is that most individuals who adopt a behavior to lower their risk will not benefit directly, although a few individuals may benefit enormously. That makes sense. All right, so for example, when you have one person who may decide to lose weight, okay, will have a very, very small impact, okay? But then if you see in a long run, when you look at say a national and or international level data, when you collate all of this weight loss, this will make a substantial impact, okay, on the country's economy, morbidity, mortality risk, incidence and prevalence risk. It is something as simple as with COVID, okay? So with COVID, as the government is encouraging for us to take individual responsibility, all right? If a person is say showing risk of COVID symptoms, all right, what is the government telling us? Please do not go outside, okay? Maintain social distancing. So this intervention, this is a say a population level intervention that the government has given us, which is maintain social distancing. The more we maintain social distancing, the less risk of morbidity and mortality, less economic burden on our hospital and healthcare system, all right, less incidence and prevalence rate. All right, that is what we saw in New Zealand. The entire New Zealand was under lockdown, okay, and then they had like no incidence or prevalence rate anymore, okay, but they were under strict lockdown for those 6 to 8 weeks. Does that make sense, guys? So this is the same thing what we are saying, that you may think that how am I going to change the world? But no, it requires one person to start somewhere. Okay, so that is what the Rose hypothesis is saying in very simple terms, is we need to start somewhere. One person making a change will impact others, the other people who are individually making a change. But when you take all of these individual data points and you look at it at a national level, at an international level, this will make a considerable difference. All right, so at the end, what the Rose hypothesis is suggesting is that epidemiological prevention approaches cannot be one way or the other. It cannot be only for high risk or only for population level, just like how dietitians always encourage moderation or a balance. Okay, so over here also you have a yin and yang balance. Okay, so I love the concept of yin and yang and I keep using it a lot. But basically what does it say? That you need to have a combination of population level approaches and high risk level approaches. That is what we are doing in COVID, guys. For example, with high risk level approaches, a lot of specialized attention, a lot of government subsidiary and grants are going towards the high risk population, such as the aged care centers, right? So we are paying specialized attention to see that individuals who are at high risk, such as our elderly individuals within the community, they are more susceptible to COVID, and we are making specialized intervention programs to see that they are not affected by COVID. Okay, so for example, just today in the news, I saw that in Victoria now in aged care centers, only carers will be allowed to see and visit the aged care individuals. All right, everything else will stop. Well, yeah, I know it sounds a bit strict, but this is for the long run, right? To benefit our high risk population. So yes, there are specialized intervention for the aged care population, but for the population level approach, all of us are encouraged to practice social distancing. Does that make sense? How you need an amalgamation of population versus high risk approach? So this is what it means, the Rose hypothesis. So basically, Rose hypothesis is a good balance for epidemiological prevention. All right, so guys, these were the several theoretical models that I wanted to cover as part of your lecture today. So I understand this has been a bit more theoretical than our other lectures, which are much more hands-on, where you're learning calculations and things, but sometimes theory is very important. Always, guys, remember that a strong theoretical foundation leads to strong practice and evidence. Okay, so all of this translation in your real life project will make a lot of sense when you have strong arguments. You develop strong arguments when you have a strong theory. All right, so I really hope this has been helpful for you. And yes, I'll see you very soon in the next lecture. Remember,